I still remember the sound of the water in the mornings, the way the sunlight touched the lake and made it shine like melted gold. For more than 3 decades, that lakefront was my peace, my refuge, my home. My father had fished there before. Me and his father before him. We weren't rich, but we had something money couldn't buy: quiet, space, and the rhythm of nature. For years, I thought nothing could disturb that balance, until the HOA came knocking. It started like most things. Do not with bulldozers and contracts, but with smiles and polite conversations. A group of new residents moved into the area, city people mostly, buying up vacation homes. They brought their lawyers, their flashy cars, and their polished words. And soon enough, they brought their rules. The Homeowners Association. Now, if you've never had the misfortune of dealing with an HOA, let me paint you a picture. They come in under the promise of community improvement. They talk about property values, safety regulations, beautification projects, and before long, you realize you can't plant a tree in your own yard without their approval. But my story wasn't about trees or fences or mailbox paint. No, they wanted something far bigger. They wanted the lake. At first, I didn't take them seriously. I'd been living there long before they even knew the place existed. I paid my taxes, I owned my land outright, and my rights were clear. The lakefront was mine, fair and square. They couldn't just take it, or so I thought. One evening, I came back from fishing to find a notice nailed to my dock. An official looking paper with their HOA letterhead at the top. It said something about rezoning, community development, and shared amenities. I read it 3 times before it sank in. They were planning to build luxury cabins along the water. 120 of them, and the cabins would sit right where my house, my dock, and my boat were. I laughed at first. I thought it had to be a mistake. But it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, they sent more notices. Letters, meetings, fines for so-called violations I had never heard of. My lawn was not up to community standards. My boat was unsightly. My fishing nets were hazards. It was like they were inventing reasons to pressure me. Neighbors who once waved at me now avoided my eyes. Some even whispered that I was standing in the way of progress. Progress. That's what they called it. I tried to fight back. I hired a lawyer, but the HOA's pockets were deep. They buried me in paperwork, court dates, legal jargon. Every day was another bill I couldn't afford. And slowly, I began to see what they were doing. They weren't just pushing me out legally. They were breaking me down. The day the bulldozers came, I stood on my porch and watched as they tore through the trees I'd grown up with. My dock went first, then the old swing my daughter used to play on. Within a week, it was all gone. Just dirt and machinery where my memories used to be. I wish I could tell you I yelled, or fought, or chained myself to the land. But I didn't. I just stood there quietly, hands in my pockets, watching it happen. Sometimes silence is the only strength you have left. When they were finished, the HOA president, a man named Richards, came over with his perfect smile and slick suit. He clapped me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Don't worry," he said. "This is for the good of the community, you'll see. We're all going to benefit from this project." Benefit. I moved into a small cabin further back, away from the water. They thought they had one. They thought they had erased me from the picture. But what Richards and his board didn't know, what none of them had even bothered to look into, was that the lake wasn't natural. It was man-made. My grandfather had built the dam with his own hands, nearly a century ago, to harness the water and create the lake. The dam was old, hidden away upriver, covered in moss and vines, but still solid. And more importantly, it was still under my name. The HOA had stolen my land. They had humiliated me, buried me in debt, and stripped away everything I loved. But they had made one mistake. They forgot about the dam, and I had every legal right to open it. I didn't act right away. No, revenge isn't something you rush. I bided my time. I watched as they built their cabins rows upon rows of shiny wooden boxes they called luxury retreats. They advertised them online with fancy photos of sunrises over the lake. Waterfront paradise, they said. An investment opportunity, a tourist. Began arriving even before the cabins were finished. Families, honeymooners, weekend warriors. They paid top dollar for that view of the water. For the fishing, the boating, the serenity, and I watched it all from a distance, quiet, patient. Every morning, I'd walk up to the dam. I'd run my hands over the old metal lever, feel the weight of it. All I had to do was pull. But I waited, because timing is everything. I wanted them at their peak when every cabin was full. When the HOA was celebrating their success, when their profits were highest and their pride was blinding. That's when I would remind them who really controlled the lake. And so I smiled and nodded and kept my silence. Because the thing about water is it always finds a way out. And soon, very soon, I would give it one. The sound of hammers and saws became my new alarm clock. For months, the air around the lake was filled with the noise of construction. Trucks rolled in at dawn, men in hard hats shouting orders, steel beams clanging against one another. Oh. Lake that had once been my peaceful retreat now echoed with chaos. And then, slowly, the cabins began to rise. At first, was just wooden frames against the horizon. Then came walls, roofs, porches, and glossy windows that reflected the sunlight like mirrors. Each week, more of them appeared until it looked like the lake was being swallowed. Whole by a small city. 120 cabins. The HOA called it progress. They called it revitalization. But I called it theft. The worst part wasn't even the construction. It was the smugness. Every time I went into town for groceries, I'd hear whispers. There's the guy who wouldn't cooperate. The old fool who tried to stop the cabins. He should have just sold while he had the chance. Richards, the HOA president, made sure of it. He painted me as the villain, the stubborn old man clinging to the past, the one holding back the community. He even wrote an article in the town newsletter, saying how some people couldn't see the bigger picture and how personal sacrifices were necessary for growth. By personal sacrifice, of course, he meant my sacrifice, my land, my home, my peace. But I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I just listened. And I waited, because every word they said, every insult, every humiliation, it all added fuel to the fire burning inside me. I knew something they didn't, something they had overlooked in their greed. The dam stood about a mile upstream, tucked away in the trees where no one bothered to look. To them, it was just an old structure from a bygone era. To me, it was a key, a lever that could change everything, and I had kept it in perfect condition. Over the years, I'd oiled the gears, replaced old bolts, reinforced the concrete. No one else cared, but I did. It was my grandfather's work, my family's legacy. And now, it was my secret weapon. The first time I walked up there, after the cabins were nearly finished, I ran my hand along the cold steel of the release valve. The wheel was stiff, but it turned, slowly, steadily. A deep groan echoed through the structure as the gears shifted. I didn't open it all the way, just enough to hear the water stir behind it, and in that moment, I realized just how much power I held. It wasn't about flooding anyone out. No, that would be reckless. It was about draining, about taking back what they had stolen, because without the lake, those cabins were worthless. Without the water, their luxury waterfront was nothing but a patch of dirt and disappointment. I smiled at the thought, then tightened the valve and walked away. Not yet, I told myself. Not yet. Meanwhile, The HOA paraded around like kings. They hosted ribbon-cutting ceremonies, invited news crews, even brought in investors. Richards loved the cameras. He stood in front of the cabins with his shiny smile, talking about economic growth and the bright future of our community. I watched it all from the sidelines, quiet, invisible. The day the cabins opened for business, it felt like a festival. Cars lined the roads, families unloaded luggage, children ran down to the water's edge. The cabins glowed with fresh paint and polished wood. Music played from speakers, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Everyone celebrated. Everyone. But me. I sat on my porch that evening, listening to the laughter carry across the lake. Fireworks lit up the sky in honor of the grand opening. Reflections danced on the water like mocking lights. And in my chest, something hardened. They thought they had won. They thought they had erased me. But they had only set the stage for their downfall, because I knew what they didn't that every smile, every toast, every firework exploding in the sky was borrowed joy, borrowed from a lake that I controlled, and when the time came, I would take it all back. The first complaints came sooner than I expected. A week after opening, a few families grumbled about low water levels. Their boats scraped against the mud, their fishing trips cut short. The HOA brushed it off, saying it was seasonal variation. But I knew better. I had tested the dam. Just a little. Just enough to lower the water line by a foot or two. Enough for people to notice. Enough to plant the seed of doubt. Richards called a meeting that weekend. He stood in front of the cabin owners, reassuring them. There's nothing to worry about. The lake is perfectly fine. It's just adjusting naturally. Naturally, I sat in the back, unnoticed, sipping my coffee with a small grin, because I knew the truth. The lake wasn't adjusting. It was obeying me, and I wasn't finished yet. That night, I walked back to the dam under the cover of darkness. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and owls. I placed my hands on the wheel, took a deep breath, and turned. This time, I didn't stop after a few inches. I kept going until the groan of metal filled the night and the rush of water surged downstream. The sound was thunderous, powerful, alive. The lake shivered, the current pulled, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the water began to drop. I stood there for hours, listening, watching, feeling the weight of it all. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about balance, about taking back control from people who thought they could own everything. By dawn, I closed the valve halfway, enough to keep the flow steady, but not so much as to raise suspicion immediately. And as the sun rose over the cabins, I knew the real show was about to begin. By the time summer was in full swing, the cabins should have been bursting with life. Families fishing off their docks, couples sipping wine by the water, kids splashing in the shallows. That was the dream Richards had sold them. The glossy brochures promised a perfect waterfront getaway. But reality looked very different. The waterline had dropped another 2 feet. What once was a wide stretch of blue, reflecting the sky, now looked wrong. The dock stood high above the muddy ground. Boats sat crooked in the shallows, and the shoreline stank of wet earth. At first, people tried to ignore it. They set up lawn chairs, took photos from the right angles, pretended nothing was wrong. But you can't ignore a lake that keeps shrinking within days. The complaints poured in. This isn't what we paid for. My kids came here to swim, and there's nothing but mud. Where's the water? What happened to the lake? The HOA scrambled. They called emergency meetings, sent out emails filled with excuses. Unusual drought conditions, they wrote. Temporary drop in water levels. Drought. The townsfolk laughed at that one. It had rained plenty. Rivers nearby were full. Only this lake was shrinking, and fast. I knew exactly why. Every night, I walked to the dam. I turned the wheel a little more, listened to the roar of the water rushing out downstream, smiled. By the second week, the lake had dropped so low that the cabins no longer looked like lakefront retreats. They looked like shacks built in the middle of a swamp. Guests started canceling reservations. Tourists demanded refunds. Angry families stormed the HOA office, waving contracts and shouting about false advertising. And through it all, Richards tried to keep his perfect smile plastered on. I'll never forget the day he came knocking on my door. He looked tired, his suit rumpled, his charm cracking at the edges. "Have you noticed the water level dropping?" he asked, pretending to be casual. I leaned against the doorframe and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I've noticed." He chuckled nervously. "Strange, isn't it? We think it might just be the weather." "Nothing serious." I said nothing. Just let the silence hang in the air until he shifted uncomfortably. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Anyway, if you hear anything, let us know." I nodded slowly. "I'll be sure to do that." He left, but not before glancing toward the lake, with worry etched across his face. That night, I opened the dam even wider. By morning, the lake was half its original size. Fish flopped in the mud, docks sat abandoned, and the once bustling cabins were eerily quiet. The luxury retreat had become a disaster zone. News crews arrived soon after. Cameras captured the dried-up shoreline, the angry tourists, the crumbling promises of the HOA. Headlines read, "Luxury lake cabins without a lake." HOA faces lawsuits over disappearing water investors furious as $20 million project collapses. I watched it all on TV from my little porch, sipping coffee, a grin tugging at the corners of my mouth. The lawsuits hit like a tidal wave. Cabin buyers sued the HOA for fraud. Guests demanded compensation. Banks threatened to pull funding. And Richards? He looked worse by the day. His perfect smile was gone, replaced with sweat, stammers, and desperation. They held one last emergency town hall meeting. The place was packed, angry owners shouting, reporters filming, chaos everywhere. Richard stood at the front, trying to calm the storm. "Please, everyone, we're working on it," he begged. "The lake will recover. It's temporary." Someone shouted from the back, "Temporary? There's no water left." The crowd roared in agreement, and that's when I decided to twist the knife. I raised my hand slowly. For the first time, everyone noticed me. The old man they had shoved aside, and I said, clear and calm, "Maybe you should have checked who owns the dam." The room went silent. Every head turned. Richards froze. His face drained of color. "The dam, someone asked." I nodded. "My grandfather built it. My father maintained it. And now it's mine. Always has been." Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Reporters scribbled in their notepads. Cameras zoomed in on me. Richard stammered, "That's impossible. The dam belongs to the county. Check the records." I interrupted. "It's in my name. Always has been." And then I turned and walked out, leaving the weight of my words to crash down on him. By the next morning, it was confirmed. Public records showed the dam was privately owned by me. The HOA had never bothered to research it. They had assumed, in their arrogance, that the lake was theirs to control. But it wasn't. It was mine, and without my cooperation, there would be no lake. The fallout was catastrophic. Investors pulled out immediately. Guests fled. Cabin owners threatened to sue Richards personally. The HOA, once so smug and powerful, crumbled under the weight of its own greed. As for me, I sat by the dam, listening to the steady rush of water downstream, and felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. Justice. isn't always served in courtrooms. Sometimes it's served by turning a wheel. The weeks after my revelation were nothing short of chaos. The HOA board, once so smug and untouchable, was now cornered like rats in a sinking ship. Richards tried to keep control, but it was over the moment the truth about the dam came out. The newspapers had a field day. Headlines splashed across every local outlet. HOA didn't check ownership of dam before building 120 cabins. $1 million mistake. Lakefront community dries up greed, drains the lake. Literally, people laughed at the absurdity of it. A project that had cost tens of millions, marketed as a dream resort, reduced to worthless cabins sitting in a muddy wasteland, and all because they had overlooked one old man, Nonai. I didn't have to lift a finger after that. The lawsuits multiplied, the investors vanished, and the HOA crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. Cabin owners went from smiling and sipping cocktails on their porches to screaming in board meetings demanding answers. Some even tried to resell their cabins, but who wanted to buy a lakefront property with no lake? Richards, the once confident president, was suddenly a man unraveling in public. His polished suits looked worn, his speeches shaky. He stopped, smiling for the cameras. And soon enough, he stopped showing his face in town at all. I heard he was being sued personally by several cabin owners. They accused him of fraud, negligence, false promises. His fancy house went on the market, his car repossessed, his bank accounts frozen. The man who once stood on my porch with that smug grin now avoided everyone's eyes. And I slept better than I had in years. Each morning, I still walked to the dam. The air was fresh. The water roared downstream, and I felt my grandfather's spirit beside me. That dam wasn't just a wall of concrete and steel, it was a reminder of who we were. Strong, patient, unyielding. For a long time, I thought the HOA had taken everything from me. But the truth was, they had only awakened something I had forgotten. Control, not control in the sense of power over others, but control over my own story. I wasn't the victim they painted me to be. I was the author of the ending they never saw coming. And yet, part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. The cabins were worthless now. Their owners trapped in investments that would never pay off. Families had lost money, not just Richards and his board. But then I'd remember the notice nailed to my dock, the bulldozers crushing my swing, the laughter of neighbors who called me stubborn, and any sympathy I felt disappeared. They had chosen greed. They had chosen arrogance. They had chosen to side with the HOA. I had only chosen to remind them of the truth. Water flows where it wants. One evening, as I sat on the dam, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold, I heard footsteps. It was a young couple who had bought one of the cabins. They looked tired, defeated. The man nodded at me respectfully. "You own this, don't you?" he asked, gesturing to the dam. I nodded. He sighed. "Guess we should have asked more questions before buying in." The woman looked at me with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Did you do it? Did you drain the lake?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the water rushing below us. After a long silence, the man chuckled bitterly. "You know what? I can't even blame you. HOA screwed us all." And with that, they turned and left. I sat there long after they were gone, listening to the sound of the water, thinking about how quickly people turn from joy to anger, from arrogance to humility. By autumn, the cabins were abandoned. Grass grew where docks once stood. Signs that had read luxury retreat now hung crooked, faded by the sun. The once bustling community was a ghost town. The HOA officially dissolved, bankrupt, and disgraced. Richards disappeared entirely. Some said he moved to another state. Others said he was hiding from debt collectors. As for me, I returned to my simple life. I fished downstream now, where the water ran stronger than ever. I built a small dock by the river and spent my evenings there, just as I once had by the lake. And though the lake above was gone, I felt lighter, freer. One night, as I sat with a line in the water, the stars reflecting above, I thought about my father and grandfather. They had built the dam not for greed, not for profit, but for survival and peace. That's what separated us from the HOA. They saw water as money. We saw it as life. And that's the truth that had drowned them. Still, I know people talk about me. Some say I'm a hero. Some say I'm a villain. I don't care either way, because at the end of the day, the lake was never theirs. It was always mine, and now it always will be. The cabins stood like empty shells by winter, where laughter and music had once echoed, only silence remained. Porches that were supposed to hold rocking chairs sat bare. Windows stared out over cracked mud, lifeless and dull. The HOA signs had been torn down, their offices shuttered. The once proud banners that read Lakefront Luxury Living were crumpled in the dirt. It was over. The mighty Project Richards had promised to be the crown jewel of the community, was nothing but a scar. On the land, a graveyard of broken dreams, and me. I lived quietly, peacefully. No longer in the shadow of bulldozers or the whispers of neighbors. Just me, my small cabin, the river, and the steady hum of the dam. But every victory has its echo. One evening, as I stood at the dam, watching the water glisten under the moonlight, I thought about everything that had happened. I thought about how quickly greed had consumed them all, and how easily they had dismissed me as some stubborn old man standing in the way of progress. Funny, isn't it? They thought progress was measured in cabins and money, but real progress, the kind that lasts, is measured in respect for people, for land, for history. The HOA never understood that, and that was their undoing. Still, sometimes I wonder if things could have gone differently. If they had come to me with respect, if they had offered partnership instead of threats, maybe we could have built something together. Maybe the cabins could have stood by the water, and families could have laughed by the lake without erasing what came before. But they didn't choose that path. They chose arrogance, and arrogance always sinks. The townsfolk learned a lesson too. Some apologized quietly when they saw me in town. Others avoided my eyes. But everyone understood now: never underestimate the man who seems silent. Because silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes silence means patience. The kind of patience it takes to wait. And then open the floodgates. One day, a local reporter came to interview me. He asked, "Do you feel guilty knowing so many people lost money?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. Do I feel guilty for protecting what was mine? For reminding them that not everything is for sale? No, I don't feel guilty. I feel free. He scribbled down my words, but I could tell he didn't fully understand, and maybe he never would. Maybe most people never will, because most people don't know what it's like to lose everything you love to greed, and then find a way to take it back. As spring came around, nature began reclaiming what the HOA had abandoned. Grass grew tall around the empty cabins, vines curled up their walls, and the once shiny wood began to rot. The lake bed, now dry and cracked, was dotted with weeds pushing through. The land was healing, in its own way. And so was I. I don't go around bragging about what I did. I don't need to. The story spread on its own, whispered from one town to the next. Some call it a tale of revenge. Others call it a cautionary story. But me? I call it balance. Because you can build cabins, pave roads, and draft contracts all you want. But if you forget the foundation, if you forget who holds the real keys, you'll lose it all. And that's what happened here, the HOA thought. They owned the lake, but they forgot one thing. They didn't own the dam, and they never will. So now, I sit here day after day, fishing off my little dock by the river, listening to the steady hum of the water below. Sometimes I smile when I think of Richards and his board. I wonder where they are now, what stories they tell themselves to sleep at night. But then I let the thought drift away, carried downstream with the current dot, because they don't matter anymore. What matters is peace. What matters is knowing I didn't need violence. I didn't need anger. All I needed was patience. All I needed was the truth and a single turn of a wheel. And that, my friends, is the story. The story of how greed drained a lake. The story of how arrogance collapsed a community. And the story of how one old man, armed with silence and patience, reminded them all that water always finds its way. Now, I'll ask you, the HOA took your lakefront, if they bulldozed your land, if they tried to erase your history, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have waited for the perfect moment to open the dam? Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment "end" so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as, please let us know where are you watching from. Before leaving, please hit the subscribe button, comment your thought, and share with your nearest and dearest one. See you in the next one. Until to the next one, stay happy. Goodbye.